Well, hello there, listeners. It's Susie New from the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, and thank you for listening to our podcast. It's called Australian Anaesthesia, and it's where we talk about all things relevant to anaesthesia in Australia. So some big news at the ASA, at the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, is that there is a new editor-in-chief heading things up at the journal Anaesthesia and Intensive Care. Not a lot of people know that the journal Anaesthesia and Intensive Care is the official scientific journal of the ASA. Supporting scientific research and the dissemination of information in the field of anaesthesia were two of the founding goals of the ASA when it was formed back in 1934, which, if you've had your head in the sand, was just over 90 years ago. I say head in the sand because we have been celebrating our 90th birthday over the last year. So anyway, I am definitely very excited to be sharing with you my conversation that I had with Professor Philip Peyton, who is the newest editor-in-chief to lead the team over at the Anaesthesia and Intensive Care Journal. I thought this would be a good time for us to get to know him a little bit better, learn what his aims are for the journal, and also have a sneak peek into the workings of a scientific journal. We both want to express our huge thanks to Professor John Loadsman, who was the previous editor-in-chief, and as you will hear, is still supporting the journal and Professor Peyton during this time of transition. All right, get ready to be inspired. Let's get into it. Thanks for giving up some time this morning / this night to join me on the podcast.
No, thank you, yeah.
And I should start by saying congratulations on becoming the new editor-in-chief of Anaesthesia and Intensive Care.
Thank you.
How are you finding it? How are you settling in?
Oh, look, I'm on a steep learning curve at various levels. It's a multidimensional challenge. There's basically learning the nuts and bolts of how the system works, because we are actually now part of a larger publishing house, which is Sage, and they've got their own systems.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that side of it. But yeah, there's the broader issue of all the challenges to producing a good product and the welfare of the journal and what we can do to serve the welfare of the specialty in Australia and New Zealand. So it's quite a lot to try to get, and I'm sort of easing into the role. It's a bit of a process. John Loadsman, the previous editor, has been very helpful and basically allowing me to gradually ramp up as he eases out of the role.
Oh, that's good. He's lovely.
So yeah, I'm sure I'll be an expert at some stage in the future.
I'll come back and ask you, what your plans and hopes are for the journal, but maybe I'll go back first. And I suppose I'm a little bit surprised that you find it such a steep learning curve, because you have such extensive CV when it comes to research. You've published so many papers, you've been involved in some really big trials like Enigma and Poise and so forth. Can I go back to when did you first start getting interested in research?
So I think since I was a kid, I always wanted to be a scientist, basically. I did medicine for all the wrong reasons. I got the marks and stuff, and my father, who's actually an engineer, said, "Oh, you should do medicine, it's a good career." Oh, okay, thanks, Dad. And I really didn't know what I was doing as a medical student or why I was there, to be honest. And I was a bit of an underachiever, and I was heading for general practice, really. And as I matured and grew in confidence, I started to look at things that I particularly enjoyed, and I just stumbled across an anaesthesia job in my advanced general practice training, and I was hooked. I thought, I love this.
Oh, great.
For various reasons. So the underlying science and the technical challenges of the job appealed to me. And then I got into the training program more by good luck than anything else. And I think as I stumbled through the training process and got through the exams, I found myself with enough headspace to think about the bigger picture, and had some good mentorship from supervisors and colleagues who said, "Oh, we should write a paper on this or that."
Mm-hmm.
So my first ever paper that I actually the first author of was in AIC.
Okay. And what stage of your career was that?
So I was a second year trainee at the Austin.
Okay.
And John Roberts was the editor-in-chief at the time, and it was very nice and very helpful. And it was a review paper on continuous spinal anaesthesia. So at that stage, CSA was a really hot topic.
Continuous spinal anaesthesia. So you're using an intrathecal catheter?
Yeah, intrathecal catheters. So basically, early generation intrathecal catheters had come into the market, and the notion of being able to put one in and do a titrated spinal became a possibility, and we're all playing around with that with very crumbly patients having particularly fractured knobs and stuff like that. And at the same time, this massive controversy arose because there were cases being reported of nerve root damage.
Right.
The catheters were being blamed for it. And
was it the lignocaine?
Yeah. When the whole thing washed up, it was clear that almost every case is associated with them using 5% lignocaine, heavy lignocaine. But anyway, I wrote a little review and put my pennyworth in about that. Some little guy from Melbourne, now the trainee, saying what he thought about this very controversial subject with all sorts of legal ramifications in the US and for patients. So that was my first little foray into the world of publishing, and it was with the journal. And I remember that quite fondly because you felt like you had somewhere to go with your local project.
Yeah.
And I think that's still the case, actually. I think it's a really important part of the remit of the journal and of our job as editors is to allow the journal to be able to fulfil that function for the specialty.
I agree.
In Australia, New Zealand and locally.
When you published that first paper as a second-year registrar, was it a requirement of the training then? Was it common for other trainees to publish?
I honestly cannot remember now if there was a formal requirement in the training scheme. I vaguely think there was, and this ticked that box for me quite nicely. So I got that out of the way early in my training, which was nice. It is why I did it, but it's not why I got a kick out of it.
What was it like getting your first acceptance letter?
Yeah, I was quite proud of that, yeah. I have to say, look, it's a bit narcissistic. I mean, particularly earlier in my career, I really enjoyed seeing my name in print. I look back, I felt that I didn't really know much. I ended up the sole author on the paper, and I look back and think, I should have been a bit more inclusive. But I just didn't know at the time. I was just young and stupid and just got on with it.
I think it's a common thing for people to do when they're young. So second year registrar, that's when you publish your first paper, and you look at where you are now in terms of your research career. What have been some of the really big moments?
Look, I've had some opportunities come which I've just followed instinctively because I liked it and they were things that pushed my buttons. And I look back and I think they were very formative for me. I have to say, there wasn't a very comprehensive structure of academic developments within anaesthesia at that time. So 30 years ago or more. And there was very little time or resources available in departments to devote to research. So it was all very ad hoc, and we all, as public hospital full-timers, always had in the back of our minds that we should be promoting research and providing opportunities for the trainees, and we all tried to do that. But it wasn't very systematic. I did a 6-month fellowship at the Alfred, cardiac fellowship at the Alfred, which was a great way to finish my training, and got involved with some interesting work in the field of lung physiology and non-invasive measurement of cardiac output. And it just had all the things I really enjoyed. It had respiratory physiology, it had cardiac physiology, it had a bit of technical stuff with the technicalities of devices and cardiac output measurement. It had the science of lung gas exchange, which has become a bit of a theme for me in my career because basically the physiology that we learn and we teach is really quite rudimentary and serves us very badly in understanding the nature of what we do in the field of inhalational anaesthesia. And the reason why I get excited about this is because this is the absolute fundamentals of how inhalational anaesthesia works. At least it has been our bread and butter for 150 years, is general anaesthesia with gases. Of course, that's now changing a bit. And people, there's a new generation of trainees now who sort of think that the gases are looking a little bit old-fashioned. And that's an interesting debate to be had. Maybe something to do at another time.
If you could change what we taught about physiology, in particular respiratory physiology in relation to volatiles, what would be some of the key differences?
So it's all about VQ mismatch. We teach VQ mismatch as what's called the Riley model or the three-compartment model. So you've got shunt on one side, dead space on the other, and then you've got this compartment in the middle, which is called the ideal compartment, where everything happens and all the gas exchange occurs in there. And it's a very conceptually simple model. And look, that's fine. Look, you can be an extremely good anaesthetist for your entire career and think that the lung is 3 boxes, and that's all fine. Trouble is, if you start to do any research in the field of lung gas exchange, you immediately find that nothing makes any sense.
Right.
If your lung consists of 3 boxes, none of the numbers that you're measuring make any sense at all. So it's a real roadblock to doing any critical thinking or research in the field of lung gas exchange, particularly in relation to how anaesthetic gases behave in the lungs. And so if you, as I've done a lot in this particular field, you measure an end-tidal concentration of your sevoflurane, and you also take a blood sample from the arterial line and measure the sevoflurane in the blood. It's actually the partial pressure in blood that's the most important. So, and there's a big difference. There's always a big AA gradient for all the gases. And when you start doing that, you cannot make any sense of the measurements that you're making unless you think of the lung as something different from those 3 boxes that the John Nunns and the John Wests of the world have taught us to think of. As I said, those models work perfectly well for physiology, clinical point of view, but as a starting point for doing research in the field, gets you off to a really bad start. And it's a pity. I've seen whole research portfolios for people stumble and fall over at an early stage. And that's a pity because they were stuck in this paradigm and they couldn't break free of it. So I've sort of been trying to publish stuff to show people that there's actually better ways to, and it's not complicated. It's actually quite simple. It's simple stuff. It's just that we don't teach it.
I'm not so confident that it's simple, but anyway.
No,
maybe...
it's funny. You show people a diagram of a realistic distribution of ventilation and blood flow in the lungs. They're actually quite simple concepts, but because we don't teach them, people look at them and they think, oh, that looks really strange.
Maybe one day you'll rewrite the textbooks on that.
Look, before I took this job, that was a serious potential sort of plan that I had as a sort of retirement project. I was thinking about writing a textbook. It was going to be something like respiratory physiology for anaesthesia and critical care. So it was going to focus on the stuff that's important to us and just teach it a different way.
Be interesting to see that.
I think I've wandered down a different path now.
Exactly. Taking another opportunity, as you were saying before. I can see you've got a real passion for research in physiology, but you've also been involved, as I mentioned before, in some of the really big trials, which are the multi-centre, large patient trial. What's your preference? What style of research do you prefer?
Look, the stuff that probably pushes my buttons the most is the basic science-related stuff, just because I've always been a bit nerdy like that. But at the same time, I've had a parallel career path in large multi-centre trials, basically because that was a movement that was happening that I was able to just hop on board with. I mean, the international leaders in that field in anaesthesia, of course, people like Paul Miles, Kate Leslie, have set up this fantastic infrastructure through our trials network, very successful. I'm one of many people who have been able to join in on that and contribute, and to sometimes take a leadership position by getting a trial of our own up and running. But it's not an either-or thing. You can do both, pursue science that interests you, whatever that might be, and still contribute to big clinical trials. At the same time, every day at the coalface, you can be doing a bit of both. And look, I've had plenty of patients that I've anaesthetised over the years where I've had them in a small mechanistic study looking at some aspect of physiology or whatever, and also enrolled in a big trial, in the Enigma trial or something like that, and basically doing two things at the same time. And I think that's an efficient use of our time. Many patients are happy to be involved because they understand that number one is you're looking after them well and delivering a good quality of care in what you do. At the same time, trying to take the opportunity to add to our knowledge about all the things that we don't really know. So much of what we do in clinical practice is driven by tradition and
correct,
and just habits, and because it seems there's a rationale for following a particular line of management.
Sure. So we'll just keep working.
Yeah, but there are so many clinical controversies that go unanswered, and we tend to sort of often get led by influences in the field of people who tell us that we should go this way or that on the basis of often very flimsy evidence.
We have influences in medicine too, don't we?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's usually most things in life. There's some degree of who you know rather than what you know. But yeah, it's often people will become influential with an idea which pushes people's buttons, and that they appeals to them, and they sort of run with that. And often a lot of enthusiasm can be engendered in a particular area on the basis of people liking the sound of something. But the evidence base behind it can be pretty ordinary. So the big trial stuff is all about trying to come up with more reliable evidence. You can only ever answer one clinical question at a time. But what a big trial does is it eliminates most of the sources of error in small trial methodology. So an awful lot of stuff that gets published in medicine is the result of publication bias and basically selective outcome reporting and all sorts of bad practice. A lot of trial results are flukes and can't be replicated. And what a big trial does is it tests an idea and works out, rather than testing what it can do, which is what a small trial does, a big trial basically measures what it will do in clinical practice. And there's always confidence limits on everything. You always have to say, look, we've only investigated this particular issue. We don't want to extrapolate our findings to outside the particular intervention that we've tested or the population that we've tested. But a big trial at least gives a reliable answer to any given question that you're answering.
Can you give an example?
Now, look, a good question is the fluid thing. The RELIEF trial was a big trial of 3,000 patients, and it basically investigated an entire worldwide movement in restrictive fluid management that was generated by a lot of enthusiastic, but in particular by one study of 150 patients conducted in Scandinavia, and which sort of suggested there were dramatic benefits to be had from restrictive fluid management. And relief was a trial 20 times larger, which actually showed it wasn't true.
Satisfying.
Yeah, but it took a lot of resources to get to that point.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Speaking of doing two things at the same time, how do you combine your clinical career and your research career? What does your average week or month look like?
So, look, it's all about synergies, really. I mean, basically, a lot of, not all lists, but a lot of the lists that I would do on a weekly basis are opportunities for patient recruitment to a large trial or maybe to a small mechanistic study instead or as well. So I just try and value add to my time in theatre by trying to see if I can have that patient involved in a research trial. I get a little bit peeved when, for one reason or another, my patient's not in a research trial. I sort of feel like I haven't made the most of my day. I've delivered what I think is good quality anaesthesia care to the patient, but I could have done more.
It's very inspiring because I know sometimes when your patient's enrolled in a trial and the research nurse asks you and says, oh, by the way, your patient tomorrow is in this trial. Most anaesthetists I've seen, their body language kind of, what do I have to do? What bloods do I have to take beforehand? How is this going to delay the start of my surgery? So I think your attitude towards it is very inspiring.
Yeah, look, if you sort of know your name's going to be on the paper one day, it's a bit of a motivator to do it. But, at the same time, I think I've contributed to a lot of trials where it's not been my trial or I haven't been one of the big names on the paper. I'm just trying to help out. For basically the same reason, so that you walk away at the end of the day feeling that you've done some little tiny chink in the wall of ignorance, that you've done something to try one day and improve our knowledge or reduce our ignorance. What's Stephen Fry's thing? That not general knowledge, general ignorance.
It's such a noble cause.
Yeah, well, each contribution is small, but it all adds up.
Lovely. Can I move on to anaesthesia and intensive care? I said I'd come back to it. I think you're in the post for the next 5 years at least. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a 5-year contract.
It sounds like a bit of an interview question, but what do you think? What are your hopes and dreams for the journal?
Yeah, look, I have to say it's a bit of a tough gig running a small national or regional journal these days. I'm sure it's not getting any easier to make. There's a whole lot of pressures on the system, which, and I think that you can sort of see from the results and the impact factors and stuff that it's not getting any easier, it's getting tougher. My hope is that I can somehow turn that around by hopefully maintaining the high standards that the journal currently has, and that's been a tradition under the previous editors of very high standards in the quality of the work that's published. There's an awful lot of things that are getting in the way. In the era of modern digital communications and globalisation, there's a whole lot of stuff which makes the job harder.
What are some of the big challenges?
Well, I think to some extent, the ease of reach now for an author to basically publish internationally just because you can. We all sort of think it'd be great to get this paper into a big international journal. And often you do that because you think you've got a shot at it. And if you do, then that's great because they're much higher impact journals. So, I mean, that's a big driver. But at the same time, it means that some of the best stuff is not coming our way. So that's a problem. And I think the digital platforms we now have for publishing make it easier to at least try and get published internationally rather than locally. And at the same time, the journal gets a lot of submissions from around the world, which are simply not of high quality. And that ranges from the slapdash poor quality to the outright fraudulent.
Yeah, right.
And my job as editor, and it's been John Loadsman's job for the last several years, is to try and protect the journal from what's essentially a continual bombardment of low-quality stuff. So basically, that will be my bread and butter as editor-in-chief, is to filter out all that stuff and to then send on to our handling editors, who are all a fantastic bunch of expert reviewers, work which is worthy of review and which we hope may or may not be publishable, but hopefully will be.
Sounds like it would be a busy job. It's
quite a relentless job, actually, because the journal's gets several hundred submissions a year. So there's always a pile of stuff on the inbox that needs to be looked at.
So out of the several hundred submissions that are received, how many end up making it into the journal?
Well, only a tiny fraction. So only about maybe a third, probably a quarter of those will actually go for formal review. The rest will be not suitable or worthy of review. That's what it looks like, the raw material that we get. And those that go for review, the success rate is obviously a lot higher, but it's the usual dynamic review process with at least 2 independent reviewers, or sometimes more, depending on the nature of the review, what comes back to us, and the revisions, and sometimes stuff won't make it over the line.
Yeah.
But to be honest, because I haven't been sitting in the chair long enough, I don't actually know what the success rate is among papers that go to formal review.
Still, it's a fascinating insight into the behind the scenes of a journal, though.
Yeah. Well, and a month ago, I was pretty clueless about all this. So it's been a steep learning curve to actually have to get in there and start managing it and seeing how it all works in action. Yeah.
Wow. Can I just, I suppose this is my last question I wanted to ask is, for people who are starting out in research, what tips would you give them?
Look, it's a very multifaceted thing. I look back and I think I've had a lot of luck at times over the years, or I've basically grabbed opportunities when they came to me. But look, good mentorship is important. I mean, if you want to develop a research career in a field, you want to make form relationships with people who know the field that you're interested in themselves, and also who have research experience and experience in getting work to publication, so a track record. So you want to reach out to people who you think are going to be able to help you in that regard and learn from them. And, that's not always easy to do, to find people who are in the right place and at the right time. And look, and as I said, that you can combine a research career. Being a clinician researcher is a genuine career opportunity for anyone who's interested in research. And really the key ingredient is interest. It's wanting to do it and getting a kick out of making a contribution to the field and to science, whether it's clinical science or basic science or whatever. So looking for those synergies, and really being a clinician is a fantastic opportunity for being a clinician researcher, because you can value add to your practice. You can still be a full-time clinician and still contribute to the multi-centre trial research. Is a great segue into research in general. But as you develop sort of a portfolio of research activity as a clinician researcher, you can then pursue your own particular interests in a particular field, and maybe even bring an idea for a trial along to your colleagues and maybe to the trials network. So we're fortunate in Australia, we've got access to those resources. Making yourself part of a team with a combination of capabilities to undertake is what you want to do. You don't want to be just beavering away on your own. You want to feel like you're part of a bigger picture and part of a team.
There's some great tips there. So find a mentor, don't give up on your passion of doing research, and collaborate is what I got out of it. That's fantastic. Just as we're, I suppose, wrapping up, is there anything else that you would like to say either about the journal or about research?
I want the journal to be something that is accessible, and it's an important resource for the specialty in Australia and New Zealand, and I want to nurture it. I want it to be able to nurture emerging researchers across the region. That's really why I've taken on the job. I want it to be able to continue to fulfill that function into the future in an environment where it's actually getting quite challenging to do that, but I'm going to give it my best shot. And I would love all my colleagues, and particularly emerging researchers and trainees who have that little spark of interest in research, to come to us with your best ideas and your best work for publication and help us to grow the journal into the future.
That's a great plug. So all future and budding researchers and newly started researchers, bring your papers along to the journal.
Yep.
Well, that's a wonderful take-home message. Thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been wonderful chatting with you.
Thanks, Susie.
Well, there you go. I hope you enjoyed getting to know Philip as much as I did. I find him so humble to speak with, and he is so passionate about research. Did you get that? As I said to him, I really find it inspiring. I also hope you enjoyed finding out a little bit more about the incredible work that goes into putting together a scientific journal. And I hope you're feeling that wave of inspiration and didn't miss that invitation. So if you're a budding researcher, get your papers in. Even if you're not a budding researcher, perhaps consider writing a review article. I know that the journal awards prizes, and that in the past, this has included a prize going to someone who wrote a good review article. Wouldn't that look good on your CV? How do I know this? It's because I did a podcast with Dr. Michael Cooper, who's on the editorial board for the journal, way back in 2020 about the prizes that were awarded that year by the journal. If you want to go back and listen to that conversation, that is podcast number 48. That's 48. And that's where I, as I said, talk with Dr. Michael Cooper, editorial board member of Anaesthesia and Intensive Care, about the prizes that were awarded from the journal that year. Of course, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And in fact, you've just given me another idea that maybe I should revisit that topic and learn more about some of the more recent prize winners in another podcast episode. If you're interested in hearing about that, let me know and I'll get onto it. Otherwise, you know the drill. Follow, subscribe, whatever you need to do to make sure that you don't miss out on the next episode of Australian Anaesthesia. All right, while I get planning, I hope that you are staying safe and well out there.
This has been Australian Anaesthesia, produced by the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, with many thanks to host and editor Dr. Susie New, with music by Soda Lime Music, sound and engineering by Bearview, and graphics by the ASA Communications team. For more content, please visit www.asa.org.au.